Salacious History discusses sex, romance, and many other topics that are intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Salacious History, the podcast that explores moments in history that were shaped by sex, romance, and people who were generally down to clown. I'm your host, Sarah Duncan. At 2 a.m. on July 11th, 1958, Mildred and Richard Loving were ripped from their beds in the middle of the night and thrown in jail. Their crime? Being married to someone of a different race. On today's show, we get the background on the Lovings' relationship and how their legal battle changed the country forever. Quick disclaimer, I occasionally use the terms black, Negro, mulatto, and Indian during this episode. I'm very aware that these terms are not current or accurate, and I assure you I'm only using these terms in order to accurately reflect the evolution of the U.S.'s laws and culture. They are not meant in a derogatory manner. Alright, here we go. Richard Perry Loving was born on October 29, 1933 in Central Point, Virginia. He was understatedly handsome, with a blonde crew cut, backwoods accent, and an unassuming manner. Richard was of Irish and English descent. Ironically, he looked like he could be a poster child for white supremacy, about as white as you can get. Mildred Dolores Jeter was born on July 22, 1939 in Central Point, Virginia. She was a woman of African American, European, and Native American ancestry, specifically the Cherokee and Rappahannock tribes. Mildred's family had deep roots in the area around Central Point where she grew up. As a young girl, Mildred was so thin that she was nicknamed String Bean. Her future husband eventually shortened her nickname to Bean. As she grew up, Mildred was described as being quite beautiful and charming, but also very shy and soft-spoken. Richard Loving had deep white Southern roots. Richard's ancestor Lewis Loving owned 7 slaves back in the 1830s, and his paternal grandfather, T.P. Farmer, served in the Confederate Army. Up until Richard's marriage to Mildred, the Loving surname had only been held by white residents within Caroline County. Despite this family history, Richard Loving and his family happily lived in Caroline County, Virginia, a county that was less than 50% white at the time. Richard's father was an employee of one of the wealthiest African American men in the county for almost 25 years. Richard's closest friends were black, including his drag racing buddies and Mildred's older brothers. Richard felt very home in this multiracial community. Richard and Mildred actually grew up just 3 or 4 miles apart from each other. They first met when Mildred was 11 and Richard was 17. Richard was a longtime family friend, but the two would not develop romantic feelings for each other until years later. Richard first visited Mildred's home to hear her siblings play music. When the pair first met, Mildred actually thought that Richard was quite arrogant. Although Mildred attended an all-black school, the area she and Richard grew up in was quite unique in terms of race relations. Blacks and whites mixed freely in the Central Point area with little racial tension, even in the midst of the Jim Crow era. It was a mixed community that saw themselves as one big family, regardless of race. After being friends for several years, the pair fell in love. Richard and Mildred dated on and off for 2 years before deciding to get married, around the same time that Mildred became pregnant. It should be noted that Mildred already had a son named Sidney from a previous relationship. Mildred and Richard were married in June of 1958. Their wedding ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal, then returned home to Virginia. They initially lived in Mildred's parents' home while Richard built a new home for the couple to live in. To understand why Richard and Mildred's relationship was so unusual at the time, we have to take a look at the U.S.'s history of miscegenation. Miscegenation refers to marriage or interbreeding among different races, and various laws have been in place to prevent its occurrence dating back to the colonial era. Out of all 50 states, 41 of them have had laws against interracial marriage at some point in their history. Let's start back in 1664. Maryland passes the first British colonial law banning marriage between whites and slaves. Among other things, this law ordered that any white woman who married a black man would then be enslaved by her husband's owner. This law did not address two important points. One, it drew no distinction between slaves and free blacks, and two, this law did not address what would happen to white men who married black women. It didn't take long for the colonial governments to find answers for these questions. 1691. The Commonwealth of Virginia banned all interracial marriages. Any whites who married people of color were subject to exile. Quote, "Be it enacted that whatsoever English or other white man or woman being free shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, shall within 3 months after such marriage be banished and removed from this dominion forever. And be it further enacted, that if any Englishwoman being free shall have a bastard child with any Negro or mulatto, she pay the sum of 15 pounds sterling within 1 month after such bastard child shall be born to the churchwardens of the parish. And in default of such payment, she shall be taken into the possession of said churchwardens and disposed of for 5 years." Unquote. This concept was so appealing at the time that Maryland implemented a similar policy a year later. In 1705, Virginia expanded the policy to impose a £10,000 fine on any clergy member who performed a marriage between a person of color and a white person. Half of this amount was paid to the informant. 1780, Pennsylvania repeals a law banning interracial marriage. This was part of a series of reforms intended to gradually abolish slavery within the state and bestow equal legal status upon free blacks. 1843, Massachusetts becomes the second state to repeal its anti-miscegenation laws. This further cemented the cultural distinction between northern and southern states concerning slavery and civil rights. 1871, Congressman Andrew King of Missouri proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution which would ban all marriage between whites and people of color for the entire country. The proposal failed. Good. Additional amendment proposals were made by Congressman Seaborn Roddenberry of Georgia in 1912 and Senator Coleman Blease of South Carolina in 1928. It's important to note that Richard and Mildred were not the first people to challenge race-based marriage bans in the U.S. In 1883, in the case of Pace v. Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that bans on interracial marriage at the state level did not violate the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The plaintiffs, Tony Pace and Mary Cox, were arrested in accordance with Alabama Section 4186, which read, quote, "If any white person and any Negro, or the descendants of any Negro to the third generation, intermarry or live in adultery or fornication with each other, each of them must, on conviction, be imprisoned in the penitentiary or sentenced to hard labor for the county for not less than 2 nor more than 7 years." Unquote. The Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's anti-miscegenation law was constitutional because, in theory, it punished African Americans and whites equally. Furthermore, in 1888, the High Court confirmed that states had the authority to regulate marriage. 1922, Congress passed the Cable Act. Although most anti-miscegenation laws targeted interracial marriages between whites and African Americans or Native Americans, this act was largely in response to the climate of anti-Asian xenophobia that was prevalent in the early decades of the 20th century. The Cable Act retroactively stripped the citizenship of any U.S. citizen who married an alien who was ineligible for citizenship. Under the racial quota system in place at the time, this primarily affected Asian Americans. Finally, 1964. In the case of McLaughlin v. Florida, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that laws banning sex between different races was in violation of the 14th Amendment. This ruling did not directly address laws banning interracial marriage, but it did lay the groundwork for what was to come. By the 1950s, more than half of all states still had laws restricting marriage by racial classifications, including all of the southern states. In the state of Virginia, interracial marriage was illegal under the 1924 Act to Preserve Racial Integrity. Anyone who violated this act could receive 1 to 5 years in the state penitentiary. Let's resume Richard and Mildred Loving's story. In early July 1958, the Sheriff's Department received an anonymous tip about the Lovings. At 2 a.m. on July 11, 1958, Richard and Mildred awoke with a start when the local sheriff burst into their bedroom. Sheriff R. Garnett Brooks shone the flashlight on the couple in bed and asked Richard, "What are you doing in bed with this woman?" Mildred responded, "I'm his wife." Richard gestured to their marriage certificate hanging on the wall, but the sheriff disdainfully replied that that document had no power in the state of Virginia. The pair were yanked out of bed and taken to the local jail. Richard and Mildred Loving were indicted on charges of violating Virginia's anti-miscegenation law, which classified interracial marriage as a felony. The Lovings had only been married 5 weeks when they were arrested. Richard spent 1 night in jail and was released after his sister posted a $1,000 bond. Mildred was not allowed bond. After spending 3 nights alone in the small women's cell, she was released into her father's care. They both pled guilty 1 year later to having violated Section 2058 of the Virginia State Code, which prohibited a white person and a colored person from leaving the state to be married and subsequently returning to live as man and wife. Judge Leon M. Basile sentenced them to 1 year in prison, but he suspended the sentence on the condition that the Lovings leave the state of Virginia and not return together for a period of 25 years. Judge Basile stated in a legal opinion, quote, "Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And, but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriage. Fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix." Unquote. Racist bastard. Though Richard Loving was generally a man of few words, he was resolute in his devotion to his wife and would hear no talk of divorce.